Are you showing this part?
No, definitely not. So just to remind you, kind of the three questions that we're working with right now are, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this commentary? How and where could it be improved? And how would you grade it? We're going to talk about that at the end after we've talked about the first two questions. So hopefully everyone's looking at the same thing. It says sample student response at the top. It starts out, this passage is about the beauty of language and the loss of the language, written by a first-person narrator.
Which one is that again?
It's called sample commentary or commentary.
On the down.
The language of the language of African literature.
Yeah, it's portal.
So, could I have a volunteer, someone who feels eloquent today, to read the first paragraph?
Me.
Cheryl, how about you?
But you asked us.
Alright.
We told you.
I was born into a large prison family.
So, sorry.
The-
Let me just preface this by saying, as Cheryl reads this, follow along and note anything that you think the author, the student, I should say, is doing well or could do better. Any qualities to this commentary that that stick out to you. Okay? Great. Go ahead, Cheryl.
I was born into a large prison family, father, 4 wives, and about 28 children. I was belonged, as well as we all did in those days, to a wider extended family and to the community as a whole. We continue.
I'm confused about where you are.
She's reading the passage.
Yeah, we should use a commentator, right?
Oh, I think you opened the extract instead of the commentary.
Yeah,
That's okay.
I already opened the other one.
So which one should
I
he
started
start
with
going to?
the first one. There is only one contract.
Are you speaking English?
You open the extra.
I'm speaking in English. He's speaking.
That's sold out by Bohan. Okay, do you have the commentary now?
And feel like someone else. I'll
Okay,
read it.
sure. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay.
You got next. Go.
The instructions. It's instructions. Right?
Don't worry about that. Just start with
Just
this passage is about the beauty of language and the loss of language. The first paragraph of the commentary.
This passage is about the beauty of language and the loss of language written by a first-person narrator. The passage was taken from the Language of African Literature in 1986. This implies that the implied producer would be the author of the first-person writer. However, the actual producer could be the variety of editors and publishers that have evaluated the text. The circumstance of this text is to depict a language of African literature was demolished as countries colonized Kenya. The writer would be from Kenya, hence we can assume that the book was published in Kenya, though it may actually be published in another country. Interest in the language of African literature. The context of reception, the receivers would imply to the African people. However, the actual audience could range from university students studying literature, teachers, school students, language analysts, and many more. The discourse and cultural perspective would be for English speakers who are interested in the language of African literature. Additionally, the discourse can be further linked to a loss of identity through language. The context of production could be to sell the book and the idea of African literature, though in context of reception, the message that this passage conveys is African person's history. Of the loss of identity through language. Fundamentally, the purpose of this passage is to illustrate the importance of what language meant to a group of patriotic people living in Kenya. Nonetheless, the dominant purpose is the loss of identity through language.
Okay, thank you.
Really weird phrase.
Okay, what do you mean?
And a lot of sentences don't make sense. Like,
I just don't
oh
get
yeah. Oh, sorry.
It says like Negubi and like random like words like.
Well, it refers to the extract that you read yesterday, right?
Yeah, I don't remember.
I think Ngugi is the language.
Oh, that
No,
sounds.
is one.
His name.
Yeah, that's his name, and then the language is another word that I have no idea how to pronounce. But yeah, you do. That's why I had you read the extract first, because it does help to have some context in order to understand this. But Paolo, what were you saying about how it's written strangely, or?
I don't know, like a lot of like the structure of the sentences doesn't make much sense to me. Like I get the idea, but it could be written differently. Like for example, this one, the writer would be from Kenya, hence we can assume that the book was published in Kenya, though it may actually be published in another country, interested in the language of African literature.
That's a good example. Yeah. Well, this is actual student work, right? So there are obviously going to be some imperfections. I think that, well, I don't want to, I guess, give this away, but I do think that language and style, like the students' language and style, are one of the weaker points of their paper one. There's some strange comma use, long sentences that just seem to kind of keep going when maybe they should stop and become a new sentence. Yeah.
Like when it says school students, and school in parentheses, that's not really necessary. A lot of things are weird.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes it's confusing. What about the content? You know, their observations.
Their
Do you think-
observations is really good because
Yeah.
like they both talk about the producer's identity and also the receiver's identity, or which can also be seen as the audience.
Okay.
And also like it discuss the purpose of the article, and that's really good.
Yep. So it talks about audience, purpose, and context.
So is that supposed to be like the intro?
I think it makes sense because that's kind of the background information.
That's like that's where it ends, and that's where you would start.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you're free to structure your own paper one however you want to, but to me, it would make sense to give like the background information first. So, audience, purpose, context, text type, maybe. Yeah. It seems like a natural way to do it. One thing I notice about this first paragraph is that the student doesn't settle on just one idea for anything to answer. Okay, I'm having trouble with words this morning. Let me give you an example instead. How about that that kind of bad sentence that Paula read? The writer would be from Kenya, hence we can assume that the book was published in Kenya, though it may actually be published in another country interested in the language of African literature. The context of reception, the receivers would be implied to be African people. However, the actual audience could range from university students studying literature, teachers, students, language analysts, and many more. The discourse and cultural perspective would be for English speakers who are interested in African English. Additionally, it can be further linked to a loss of identity through language. So one thing I notice about this section is that the student pushes themselves to consider additional possibilities. They don't just settle on sort of one answer, right? So they say it could be published it was probably published in Kenya, although it could also have been published here. They're trying to deduce the context from the information that they have, but they're also admitting, you know, a degree of uncertainty. They say the context would be implied to be these people, however, the actual audience could also be all these people.
Should you do that?
Should you?
Do what he's doing, or just like stick with one main answer, like properly?
I personally view this as a strength. I mean,
This is strength.
yeah, I think that the student's willingness to consider more than one possibility, right, more than one possible context, more than one possible audience, to me shows that they're reflecting on their own ideas, right? So, sort of a metacognition, like, well, I think it's this. However, you know, I could be kind of wrong about that. It could also be this. Obviously, you know, there's a point where it would no longer be productive to talk about all the different possible contexts and all the different possible audiences. But to suggest, like, you know, maybe two options two possible interpretations, I think that's a strength.
So it's better to show more than one option rather than just taking one side?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how likely you think that second option is. Right? In this case, he's not, or she is not totally sure about, for example, where the book was published. So they're admitting the possibility that it could also be published here for, for this reason, and they're kind of explaining their logic.
So it's mostly assumption, like we're not really given any,
Actual
yeah.
No, it depends on the text that you receive. You could get the publication date, the medium of publication, and the author's name and where it was published, or you could get none of that. Yeah, that's my understanding of it anyway. Okay. Yeah, but then there's a nice strong finish to this paragraph. It has a strong beginning and a strong conclusion, right? This passage is about the beauty of language and the loss of the language, written by a first-person narrator. Wow, great direct introduction to the paragraph, moving right into it, focuses right on the passage immediately. And then the last sentence, or the last two, fundamentally the purpose of this passage is to illustrate the importance of what language meant to a group of patriotic people living in Kenya. Nonetheless, the dominant purpose is the loss of identity through language. I have to say that's not really a purpose, that second one. That's more of a theme or an idea.